evening, everyone. I don't know if this is working. Hello, hello. There we go. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the final panel of the day here. It's a pleasure to be moderating this session. My name is Michael Kraft. I work with UNICEF evaluation team in Latin America, Caribbean, and we have a really diverse selection here of panel members from different institutions that working in impact evaluation in Latin America, Caribbean. And what we wanted to do for this final session is have a bit of a round table, more metaphorically, a straight table in the physical sense here, on how impact evaluation in Latin America and Caribbean is really responding to the emerging and complex challenges that are distinct to the region. And first and foremost, this recognizes the rich history of impact evaluation in the region. The fact that starting in the 90s with emblematic cases like Bolsa Familia and Progresa, these countries, including Mexico and Brazil, really were pioneers in pushing the envelope in impact evaluation. And following that, the kind of institutionalization of impact evaluation in the region. And so we have distinct characteristics of the region, both in terms of its capacity, in terms of its legacy. But that said, we also want to recognize that the context across the region, especially relating to fragility and conflict, continues to pose challenges for the practice. And so what we'll do today or this evening and try to keep this under an hour is understand a bit from each of the panelists how their institutions are confronting these types of challenges, conflict, climate, violence that we see across the region from their institutional perspectives, and then look at questions of equity and also partnerships. And we hope that also will have a bit of an action orientation in that sense and come away with some ideas as a community about where to take the practice in the region. So let me just briefly present our panelists. To my left, we have Dave Evans, the Principal Economic Advisor of the Social Sector at the Inter-American Development Bank. We have Carol Cruz Ugade on the end here as an economist at the Ministry of National Planning and Economic Policy of Costa Rica. We have Riaz Lodi, who is the representative and country director of the World Food Program in El Salvador. And finally, Allison Stone, the regional director for Latin America Caribbean at Innovations for Poverty Action. So with that introduction, let's pass straight to the panel for a first segment, really looking at the distinct experiences of these of your different institutions, and really having a kind of general reflection about the strategic role of impact evaluation in the context of these evolving trends in the region. Over to you, Dave.
Thanks so much for that introduction. Before I talk about what the Inter-American Development Bank is doing, I think it's useful to think about the massive expansion in impact evaluation in the region. So if you look at the 3IE, the International Initiative for Impact Evaluation database, we find registered in Latin America and the Caribbean in the last decade 1,600 impact evaluations. That's taking out all the synthesis reports, everything. That's more than a doubling of the impact evaluations from the previous decade. And of course, relative to other regions, Latin America already has a relatively high number, better access to data, lots of researchers, in countries with who are doing these. And so, it's really striking. Even in the more fragile areas, we found, for example, in Haiti, more than 30 impact evaluations, obviously a difficult place to carry those out. And so we're learning a lot. At the IDB, one of the things that we're trying to do is really focus in collaboration with researchers in the region on what we can learn about key issues. And so I'll just mention three quick examples. One is Venezuela, where we've seen the biggest spike in poverty of any country in the region. And so a team of researchers led by Elena Arias Ortiz and others have been working in rural Venezuelan schools to basically say, okay, can we use radio math lessons to improve education? These are programs that have been effective in Peru and Panama, but Venezuela is a very different environment. What they found is that you could see a very large increase in early childhood numeracy with these radio lessons, but only in particular places, right? In truly remote areas and areas where parents have very little education, right? They see no impacts in places where those conditions don't hold. So big implications for how we allocate resources. That's one. A second example is when we think about one of the biggest issues in the region is gender-based violence. And so in Peru, for example, the last statistic I saw was that more than half of women reported experiencing violence in their between the ages of 20 and 50. So the Gender and Diversity Lab, the GD Lab at the IDB, which regularly hosts calls for external researchers to propose research. Amber Peterman, who's here, has chaired one of those. So as part of that, Claudia Piras and others have tested a WhatsApp-based intervention in Peru to basically targeted at men to sort of teach issues of consent and healthy sexuality. And what they saw interviewing not the men, but the men's partners was, a really sizable decrease in sexual assaults and an increase in consent in the context of this WhatsApp intervention at pretty large scale. And the third key issue in the region that I'll mention is in some parts of the region, especially in the Caribbean, we have a real scarcity of data, right? I think of Latin America generally as very data rich, right? But in the Caribbean, we have many countries where we haven't had a household survey in a decade. And so in that context, impact evaluations have been a useful way of helping to digitize data that exist. And so, for example, Dieter Boerman and others have worked together with the government of Trinidad and Tobago and other governments to digitize lots of existing records, but then use that to identify, for example, how parents choose schools, what parents value beyond test scores. It turns out schools that reduce crime and that reduce adolescent pregnancy. Not a huge surprise, but there's this hand-in-hand relationship where the impact evaluation agenda can also strengthen a broader data agenda, which we can use for many things in the countries. Thanks.
Thank you. Over to you, Allison.
Thanks, Michael. IPA has a number of different projects in the Latin America region. We work across a variety of sectors. We have a number of completed projects and ongoing projects in the areas of security and crime reduction, as well as migration. Now, while both crime and migration are major challenges for the region currently, there is very little rigorous evidence on what works to counter crime, violence, and instability, or on how to improve outcomes for migrants and displaced populations in the region. In the areas of security, crime, and policing, existing evidence from impact evaluations is primarily from OECD countries, and that evidence shows modest impacts at best. On migration, there's limited evidence on how to integrate migrants into the social and economic fabric of new countries in ways that are sustainable and also consider the needs of the host population. Given the limited evidence in these fields, policymakers are left with little guidance on which strategies can help to address their biggest security concerns and their migration challenges. In IPA's collaborations with policymakers in the region, we've seen a great deal of interest and evidence on what programs could work to combat these challenges. Some interventions in these areas may be very costly to implement, and so policymakers are particularly interested in ensuring they're using their limited resources as effectively as possible. In the impact evaluations that we've conducted so far related to crime and security, we've seen a variety of outcomes. Some interventions have proven to be effective, while others have shown to be ineffective, or even some with some negative effects. As one example, in Cali, Colombia, we collaborated with the mayor's office to evaluate a military policing program called Plan Fortaleza. The use of military forces for public security has become a common approach to combat crime and insecurity in the region. Advocates of this approach view military forces as necessary to control crime, while detractors claim they undermine human rights. We conducted a randomized evaluation to rigorously measure the impacts of the program on crime rates and human rights. In this study, city blocks were randomly selected to receive military patrols, while a comparison group received the normal police presence. The study findings showed that the military patrols did not reduce the prevalence of crime, even when the soldiers were physically present on the streets. Instead, we actually observed a large and statistically significant increase in crime in the blocks that received the military patrols in the weeks after the intervention was complete. These results indicate military policing may not be an effective strategy for reducing crime and may actually lead to an uptick in crime following the presence of the patrols. As a contrasting example, in Mexico City, we collaborated with the Ministry of Public Security to conduct a randomized evaluation of a procedural justice training for police officers. In this study, 60 police sectors across the city were randomly assigned to receive a procedural justice training or to be in a comparison group that did not receive the training. The results of the study showed that the training had significant positive impacts on the perceptions of individual police officers and also on police behavior in their interactions with citizens. So in conclusion, I think there's a critical role for impact evaluation to help us to carefully evaluate potential interventions in the areas of security, crime, and migration. We have limited evidence of what works in these areas, and we have some evidence of programs that do not show positive impacts. And we've seen that policymakers are very eager to have more evidence informing their decisions about which programs to implement and to promote with their limited resources. Thanks.
Thank you, Allison. And passing now to Carol from the government of Costa Rica.
Gracias, Michael. Bueno,
Thank you, Michael.
para el gobierno de Costa Rica, la variable ambiental siempre ha sido una variable estratégica en el marco de la gestión pública.
For the government of Costa Rica, this has been elemental for the management of public policy.
Y cuando hablamos de evaluación, no es la excepción.
And evaluation is not the exception.
Del total de nuestras evaluaciones, el 8% se concentran en la temática de ambiente, biodiversidad o cambio climático.
8% of evaluations in our country are about the environment, climate change, or medio ambiente, cambio climático y qué? And biodiversity, perdón.
Gracias. Siendo el sector ambiente jugando un papel estratégico con la finalidad de actualizar los planes estratégicos o sus estratégicas para alcanzar específicamente los objetivos de desarrollo 14 y 15.
And the environment is one of the strategic focuses in order to either update the plan or modify the plan in order to meet targets 14 and 15 on the environment.
Como el resultado de estas evaluaciones, aproximadamente el 70% de las recomendaciones que se generan a través del mecanismo de la evaluación han sido totalmente aceptadas.
As a result of the evaluation, 70% of the recommendations of these evaluations have been accepted,
concentrándose aproximadamente un 40% en la variable de la gobernanza.
40% approximately is focused on governance.
Esto por cuanto se busca, ¿verdad?, que las políticas estén ligadas a las realidades locales y una mejora de la gestión.
We seek to have policies more adjusted to local realities and a management of these policies.
Las evaluaciones han venido a decirnos que necesitamos mejorar la gobernanza ambiental, donde funcionan o interactúan diferentes actores, el sector privado, el sector de la organización civil, el gobierno y los grupos minoritarios.
Evaluations have pointed to the fact that we need to improve environmental governance, including the private, the civil, the government, and the environmental actors.
Sí. Ahí debemos fortalecer nuestros modelos.
We need to strengthen our models. Perdón.
Asimismo, también aproximadamente un 20% de las recomendaciones se ajustan o no señalan que es necesario ajustar la teoría de cambio de estas estrategias en materia de ambiente para focalizar mejor lo que estamos haciendo y alcanzar resultados más sostenibles.
20% of the recommendations point to the fact that we need to adjust our theory of change, to adjust and modify our strategies in order to meet and adapt to the realities and improve our management of the environment.
Y otro 20% está relacionado de nuestras recomendaciones con la incorporación de la participación y la rendición de cuentas como mecanismo para abordar los desafíos de manera multidisciplinaria en cuanto a materia ambiental.
In terms of the environment, another 20% of the recommendations point to the incorporation of accountability and participation to improve our environmental management policies.
La finalidad de estas recomendaciones busca entonces la creación de políticas más resilientes ante los cambios climáticos.
We seek to create policies that are more resilient to climate change.
Gracias.
Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Caro, y a ti también. Arias, for you, please.
Thanks, Michael. WFP is an organization with this mandate of saving and changing lives. So our programs are regularly updated and adapted to the local realities. So impact evaluations are a crucial source of learning in all WFP activities, as they offer significant value for improving our work in the field. In the LAC region, there has been more emphasis on impact evaluation in the past few years, and we have organized 4 impact evaluations in El Salvador, in Peru, in Guatemala, in Haiti. And they were done on cash-based transfers, gender and school-based programs. Since I represent El Salvador, maybe I can share with you an example of the impact evaluation we carried out in El Salvador in 2021 and 2022, which strengthened our programs to better suit the needs of the populations we serve. Here we use conditional and unconditional cash transfer as a food assistance modality because markets are functioning and food is available. And we often use food for asset creation as an early recovery and as a resilience modality. This evaluation focused on the impact of the cash-based transfer on food security and gender equality in El Salvador. It assessed the impact of including women to work outside their household as part of the Food for Asset program and receive direct cash transfer. It was contrasted with a group of households receiving an unconditional cash transfer, which is usually received by men. And there was a comparison group that did not participate directly in the program. The results supported the theory that we tested and suggested offering women an opportunity to receive cash transfers in exchange for participating in activities outside their household is an effective way of supporting women's economic empowerment. It also showed that WFP's unconditional cash-based transfers programs had a significant but short-term impact on food security. But at the same time, the impact on women's economic empowerment was much longer lasting, as it lasted several months after the program ended. This was the evaluation, but I think the underlying question is what we did with the evaluation, how the evaluation helped our programs. So we did a number of things based on the findings of the evaluation. For instance, we included workshops with men in our programs to foster behavior change to make sure that they have acceptance of women's role in the food for asset type activities. WFP also diversified financial service providers to make sure that the facilitate women's participation and bring them as close as possible to their homes. And there was a significant change in their lives when we started opening bank accounts for women, which gave them access to microcredit in future, and they had more independence in making their decisions. And also we adjusted our training programs to suit the women's schedule as they had other things to do in their households. So this also helped improve their participation in the programs. Thank you.
Thank you. Moving to a next kind of area that we'd like to discuss, I think it's clear to a lot of practitioners in the room the intersectional nature of deprivations that populations with greater vulnerabilities face in the region, including indigenous communities, Afro-descendant groups, young girls. Turning to Dave first, then Carol, how can we leverage impact evaluation for more equitable outcomes, thinking both in terms of methods and approaches and how we're conducting the impact evaluation, as well as potentially how we're promoting the results of impact evaluation for more equitable outcomes?
Thanks. That's a great question. I would say the biggest inequity, so one is, what are the greatest inequities in what we're learning? And this forum is focused on fragile contexts, and there is a huge gap in the number of impact evaluations that we're doing. So I mentioned 1,600 impact evaluations over the last 10 years. So in Venezuela, that number is 6, right? And so in 10 years. That's registered in one source. Maybe somebody could find a couple of others, but I think the inequality will still stand. And so, that said, what I've seen again and again in the last 2 days is that it is possible to do impact evaluations in challenging settings, right? But it takes additional financing, it takes additional effort, and it takes a fundamental commitment from individual researchers and from institutions that back them. The IDB is one that, I mentioned a couple of examples, and we could certainly continue to improve in that space. In terms of outcomes, one of the things that I see as I review impact evaluations is that many impact evaluations simply ignore equity, right? So they report the outcomes. How much did this improve education? How much did it improve health outcomes? There's a subset that does look at distributional effects, right? And so there's a hint of equity there, but many don't. Many report average effects, and we have actually no idea from those impact evaluations whether they are in fact equity enhancing or equity decreasing. In many cases, impact evaluations, Marcus Goldstein did some analysis a few years ago that showed that a tiny fraction of impact evaluations even identify whether the beneficiaries of the interventions are poor or not, which makes it very difficult to think about that. The last thing I'll say is, if we think about specific groups, so children in the region are much more likely to be poor than the average population. So in Latin America, children are 14 percentage points more likely to be poor than the average population. Children are more likely to be poor everywhere because young families, but in the US, for example, it's 2 to 3 percentage points, right? Versus 14 percentage points in Latin America. It's massive. So what that means is that if we focus our impact evaluations and interventions on children, we are on average, likely to be equity enhancing. Two other groups with high poverty rates are Afro-descendants and indigenous people. And what I find is we actually have a real scarcity of impact evaluations that are targeted. There are exceptions, and I can point to examples. There's a great example that Emma Naslund-Hadley and others did, looking at culturally appropriate education for indigenous groups in Panama, and found sizable educational impacts. But on average, what we often find is impact evaluations, maybe they have a very small subset because they're not targeted to high poverty groups. They have a small subset and can't really draw conclusions. And so if we want to be equity enhancing, we have to think about distributional effects, so how it affects the poorest beneficiaries versus the less poor. And we have to think about making sure that we sample appropriately groups that are at particular high levels of vulnerability so that we know whether the programs are working for those groups as well, worse, or better than they are on average.
Thank you. Carol, to you.
Sí, claro. Bueno, el desarrollo socioeconómico de Costa Rica se basa mucho en los servicios que nos regalan los ecosistemas.
The economic development of Costa Rica is greatly based on, to a great extent, based on the services that are given to us by the ecosystems.
Sí. En este marco, digamos, en este contexto, la evaluación de la Estrategia Nacional de Biodiversidad buscó
And in this context, the evaluation of the National Strategy on Biodiversity seek to
No solo cómo se está alineando la estrategia o cuánto está contribuyendo al logro de las metas de los objetivos de desarrollo 14 y 15,
not only measured how much it aligns or is contributing to the targets of goals 14 and 15,
sino de qué manera el principio de equidad definido en el marco de la Agenda 2030 se incorporó tanto en el diseño como en la implementación de la Estrategia Nacional de Biodiversidad.
but also how much does the component of equity, which is included in the 2030 agenda, was incorporated and or influenced the modification of our strategy in terms of biodiversity.
Sí. Es decir, si en el momento en que se diseñó la estrategia se incorporaron las prioridades, las necesidades y los intereses de los diferentes grupos prioritarios o grupos meta.
In other words, when the design of the strategy was made, did we incorporate the needs, the needs and the priorities of the target groups?
Y además, ¿qué tan equitativa es la implementación de las diferentes metas de la estrategia en la incorporación de estos grupos prioritarios?
And how equitable is the implementation of these targets in this targets of these goals in and for the target groups?
Y lo que encontramos es muy interesante, digamos, porque ahí donde tenemos información sobre la población indígena,
And it's interesting because where we have information on the indigenous population,
se crearon su propia estrategia nacional de biodiversidad y fue incorporada muchas de sus metas en el marco de la estrategia nacional de biodiversidad.
they created their own national strategy on biodiversity, and in turn, we incorporated some of those targets in the national strategy for biodiversity.
Y no solo eso, sino que en el marco de la implementación, cuando fuimos a revisar el avance de esas metas en el marco de la estrategia, la mayoría de estas metas tenía aproximadamente el 80% de su cumplimiento.
And when we reviewed the implementation and advances of the goals, 80% of the goals had been, in fact, met.
Lastimosamente, en la revisión de otros grupos prioritarios como el sector pesquero, el sector agricultura, las mujeres, no teníamos información en cuanto a la implementación o qué tan equitativa estaba siendo la corresponsabilidad o la implementación de estos grupos prioritarios en el marco de la implementación de la estrategia.
Unfortunately, in our other reviews of other groups, such as target groups, in terms of equity, we did not have enough information to see how equitable implementation was for groups such as the fishing, agriculture, or women.
Entonces, en conclusión, ¿qué encontramos? Que allí donde se aumenta la participación en el diseño y en la implementación, encontramos resultados más sostenibles a lo largo del tiempo.
And what we found is that when we include participation in the design and implementation of the strategy, our results are more sustainable.
Gracias.
Thank you.
Gracias, Caro. As our last question before opening up to the audience, wanted to kind of build on the call we've heard over the last few days to work together, the call and the urgency to kind of prioritize evidence gaps and respond to those gaps through joint efforts. So turning to Riaz first, then Allison, what would be, from your experience in both WFP and IPA, key strategies for strengthening collaboration and partnerships and impact evaluation in the LAC region?
Thanks, Michael. There's an African saying, if you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, go together. So the objective of our work is to change the lives of people, to improve their lives, whether we are in a humanitarian setup or a development setup. We definitely want to go far. So we work together. We work with our partners. So this evaluation that I just presented, first of all, there was a collaboration, internal collaboration among different divisions in the organization. So the evaluation division, the cash-based transfer division, the social protection division, and we came together, and the country office of El Salvador, so this was done together. And externally, our main corporate partner was the World Bank, and many experts were assigned not only data collection but also analysis. On the other hand, the lesson we learned from this evaluation, based on that, we have incorporated working with partners not only for assessments and implementation, but also for evaluations, monitoring and evaluations, working with the local universities, working with local and international NGO partners in the country, many research institutes. The government also takes part in this. So this is an ongoing process. I would like to mention here the USAID's, the BHA program also participated in capacity development of staff, of World Food Program staff and the partners through their From Boring to a Brilliant program, that's the title. So this is a great example of partnerships. And this is an ongoing partnerships. And we are, as I said before, evaluations are important, but yesterday was mentioned that evaluations, if they're not transferred to actions during implementation or activities, they are worth nothing. In our case, they are extremely helpful in our programs. So this is how, in a nutshell, WFP is applying partnerships at different levels to make sure that we learn lessons from our implementation of programs and we apply them to our future programs. And one important thing that I would like to mention also is that the results of this evaluation were also shared with the government so that they could apply them to their own program and with partners. So this is how we see it as a multiplier effect of our evaluations when they are done, especially with the other partners. They seek longer term results. Thank you.
Thank you, Allison.
I'll mostly echo what Riaz has just said about the essentialness of collaborations and partnerships for the success of impact evaluations in the region. Through IPA's work with partners in the region and elsewhere, we've had success finding small organizations with innovative solutions and working with those partners to refine, pilot, evaluate, and scale their programs. Also, our ongoing work with governments in the region, including in Medellin, Colombia, and in Mexico City, has shown that policymakers want support to design and pilot new strategies to respond to security challenges. It's very important that interventions aiming to reduce crime and improve citizen security are tailored to the specific local context, such as who are the local criminal organizations, what are their sources of income, etc. An intervention that works in one city may not work in another, and so it's very important to design interventions that are specifically responsive to the realities on the ground. Given this, I think it's essential to invest in long-term iterative partnerships with local organizations and government agencies to identify the critical sources of insecurities in a given place and to define, design, pilot, and evaluate potential solutions. I think it's also very important that we support local actors with evidence in all stages of the process, and not only when an intervention is at the stage and scale to be a good fit for an impact evaluation. This can include helping partners to incorporate existing evidence into the design of programs so that new interventions build off of the evidence base that already exists. Then, as a partner is refining their programming, we can use process evaluations as a tool to understand and strengthen the mechanisms of the intervention. Then, of course, conducting a rigorous impact evaluation when appropriate to determine the outcomes of an intervention. And then after an intervention is conducted, partners should be supported to understand and share the findings, to position effective solutions for scale up, and to continue to utilize their monitoring data to drive iterative decision-making in future programming. So in summary, I think it's very important that we invest in long-term partnerships with local actors and to support those partners with evidence and different evaluation tools throughout all stages of the learning process. Thank you.
Thank you, and let's open it up for discussion. I think there's a lot to reflect on across those themes, and also to build on a lot of what we've heard in the last few days. Looking, of course, with the Latin America, Caribbean lens here. I mean, we have colleagues in the room that are leaders and participants in different communities of practice. Some of them are more specialization-based, like for economists with LACEA. Some are more, research and academic. Here we have a kind of multi-stakeholder group, so I think it's quite a interesting opportunity to reflect together on this particular question of collaboration, and also, of course, any questions for the panel that you care to ask. So please, let's open it up to the floor. You just press your mic and... Yes. It's 2935. We'll start with Adriana then, who has her mic.
I got it, sorry.
Yeah. Please go
I'm
ahead,
the winner,
Adriana,
right?
and then we'll move to... Yeah.
I'm sorry. Okay, well, as you mentioned, and you mentioned as well that you're interested in collaboration, I'm the head of the Impact Evaluation Network in LACEA, together with another colleague from the IDB, precisely, Oscar Bietic. And we organize a conference every year, which is next year is going to be in May in Universidad del Pacífico in Peru. And generally, we receive around 80 or 90 submissions. These are all papers that are done with impact evaluation methods and well identified, let's say, and they're all mostly from the region. So I think this is a good way to know which are the topics that are being studied right now. So please just I'm gonna put in contact with you, or I'll give you my email, and maybe we can keep in touch to find out which are the collaboration that we could do with your countries or with your institutions.
Thank you, Adriana. 2935. There we go.
Yeah, now it works, right? Okay, so that's my. I have a question for Dave. By the way, Silvio Leidone, Evaluation Officer in FAO. So you rightly mentioned the problem of reaching certain groups of the population, also for more equitable outcomes. Especially you mentioned indigenous populations, that in many of these programs, the development programs that we try to evaluate, very often are neglected. And do you have any words of wisdom how we can reach? Because sometimes it's very difficult, also because it's different. It's way different the way we have to approach and target this community. I'm just making a simple example. So in the context of the GCF programs in Paraguay, which targets both in campesinos, in indigenous and non-indigenous populations, we are trying to do we tried to do the impact evaluation for both groups. PROESA, this program in Paraguay, reaches the most vulnerable communities and seeks to reforestate. So it's a reforestation program, basically. But here it's where the outcomes, where the devil is in the detail, because the outcomes is it's land use, basically. And land use for indigenous population is completely different related to non-indigenous population, because on the one end is individual level, farm level, on the other side is community level. So when we have to measure impacts for this group of the population, we cannot use the classical tools of analysis, because as you might understand, we will be severely underpowered. So what we have thought during the inception phase of the design of the evaluation, we thought, okay, let's go ahead with some geospatial evaluation. We mapped all the indigenous populations, and okay, we will rely on satellite images for the land that has been reforested. This was one of the, let's say, the trick that we have come out. But this is because it's specific, it's an outcome that we can measure through satellite images even very well. It's a bit costly, but especially if you want the teeny-weeny details, the very precise measurement. But there are some other outcomes that are really at the individual level that it's different the way we, we reach the community. So I don't know if you have any experiences from your recent evaluation that you like to share with us that might also provide some suggestion for similar exercises. Thanks.
Thanks so much. That's a great question and a great example. Thanks for sharing that example of some creative thinking about outcomes, because it is a challenge. From the work that I think that others have done at the IDB and in the region, I would say two things. One is, I think in some cases, what it means is we have to think about targeted interventions, so specifically targeted interventions. And so in this case, that wasn't the approach. In this case, the approach was, saying how this broader intervention affects this subgroup of indigenous persons. I think that's also incredibly important. So I think the two strategies there are, one is creative thinking of outcomes, and the other is just simply that what I've seen is a number of studies do is you just massively oversample key vulnerable groups, right? And so when we think about it, the power calculation stage, if we really care about knowing whether, a lot of people who evaluate impacts, we kind of, because of budget concerns, we power our studies for the average effect, and then we kind of wave our hands and say, like, well, let's hope for the best. And if we actually care about measuring impacts for the most vulnerable groups, in a lot of cases, we can't even just wave our hands. It means sort of massive oversampling. There are trade-offs there, certainly. And so depending on the country, it'll sort of, it'll make a difference about whether that's the right strategy. But it's what we have to do if we actually want to learn what works for indigenous populations, for Afro-descendants. A third group that's highly vulnerable that is in the region I'll just mention, that I didn't mention before, is the intersection of extreme chronic poor, right? That's one of the groups that we know the least about how to help in a sustainable way. We know that giving cash arithmetically reduces their poverty, but in terms of sort of sustainable sort of change, that's one of the groups that's least studied and most difficult to reach as well. And another area where we need to experiment with both targeted interventions and oversampling within the context of general interventions.
Thank you. If there's no other questions, I think we're the final minutes of this session. But we can take one or two other questions if anybody wants to jump in. Last session of the day, yeah. I think to energize the last few minutes, we were talking as a panel about how to also frame for the future, thinking about actions as a community, thinking about takeaways in the Latin America region, and so Latin America Caribbean region. So turning to the panel in closing, what would be one potential action across these themes that we've discussed, in your opinion, that would be worthwhile taking forward as a community? Maybe we start and go from right to left, starting with Dave.
Okay. I'm going to cheat because I'm first and we have like 3 minutes left, and I'm going to say more than one thing. First, I'm really glad that the LASEA Impact Evaluation Network was brought up. I'd encourage people to submit and attend that. That's a very important initiative. So I mentioned understudying certain countries. The Inter-American Development Bank has collaborated with others to finance a large panel survey in Venezuela, a country that is one of the most underrepresented in impact evaluations. That is a publicly available panel data set, and so I would encourage you to use it. And more broadly, and as we think about our programming, to say, what are the countries where we know the least? And to make an effort in our programming from year to year to say, these countries, or within countries, these groups, we're going to explicitly include a concrete goal of increasing representation of those within our knowledge, our knowledge agendas. Thanks.
I would say, to reiterate some of what I already said, long-term local partnerships, especially with local government entities, I think are really essential so that we understand what are the research questions that our government partners have, so that we look for opportunities to share evidence with them when they're designing their programming, opportunities to conduct impact evaluations when relevant, to position our findings for use at scale. So that's what I would really emphasize. Thanks.
Yesterday and today, we talked a lot about the cost effectiveness of our programs and cost effectiveness of our evaluations. I'm a strong supporter of cost effectiveness because I'm a country director and I have to fundraise. So no one can know more than me the cost effectiveness of everything. But I can say that having done an evaluation in El Salvador, it's worth it, because a good evaluation, even if it's not cost effective, it can help us make our programs cost effective. So, and if El Salvador, a small country office, relative to many bigger country offices we have, if we can afford to do it, I think everybody can do it. Thank you.
Sí. El llamado a la acción desde la experiencia costarricense.
The call to action from the Costa Rican experience
Sí. Sería incorporar los criterios de los ODS, los principios de los ODS, como un elemento
is
en el
to
proceso de evaluación. Perdón.
include the criteria of the SDGs as one of the elements in the process of evaluation.
Si no hubiésemos innovado en la incorporación de estos, de la equidad y del principio de corresponsabilidad compartida que menciona la Agenda 2030, no hubiésemos encontrado estos resultados que hoy les presenté.
Had we not innovated and included the principles of responsibility and equity that the 2030 agenda includes, we wouldn't have obtained the results that I just discussed.
Y por tanto hoy estuviéramos con la brecha de conocimiento en cuanto a cómo expandir, o mejor dicho, hacer intervenciones en materia ambiental más resilientes y adaptativas.
And we would still have a bigger gap today in terms of knowledge as to interventions about the environment that are resilient.
Gracias.
Thank you.
Well, join me in thanking the panel for these really rich reflections and actions. And thank you all for staying late.